a Ramban here, very beautiful Ramban. You have the Mikros Gadol's Chumash. He says, "HaSefer Hazeh Inyano Yedushu Mishnah Torah." The Sefer Dvorim is referred to as Mishnah Torah. It's a review of many of the mitzvahs that were said in the previous Chumashim. Yivarbo Moshe Rabbeinu Ledor HaNichlas B'Oretz. Moshe is going to explain to the generation that's going into the land, Rov mitzvahs atzrichas liYisrael, the majority of mitzvahs which are needed for Klal Yisrael. V'lo yaskir bo dover b'toras kohanim. V'lo b'maisa korbonos, lo b'tairas hakohanim b'masayim. It's interesting. Mishnah is a review of all the mitzvahs that were given previously to the new generations going to Eretz Yisrael. But Sefer Vayikra, which is known as Torah's Kohanim, the laws which apply to the Kohanim, the Leviim, in terms of how they officiate, what disqualifies them, that's not reviewed in the Sefer Dvarim. But all the other mitzvahs are. Shrakvir Osam, because they already explained in the book of Vayikra. V'kohanim is Rizim Heim, v'lo yitztarchu la'asora ach asora. You know, it's interesting. We find that why are there fences? Why did they legislate and promulgate fences? Because a person naturally doesn't have that level of cognizance, and there's always some degree of lack of clarity because of person's levels of distraction. Therefore, they have to initiate and legislate fences for those occasions where we don't have that level of acuity at that particular moment. But the Gemara says there are laws which pertain to Kohanim, which we don't find those fences. Why? Because Kohanim is Rizim Heim. The Gemara says this term. Kohanim are naturally, they do things with alacrity, and they take things into consideration. So therefore, those concerns that we have regarding other Jews, other segments of Klal Yisrael, those concerns are not concerns regarding Kohanim. So if you read the Gemara, and it's mentioned a number of times in Shas, Kohanim's Rizim Heim, they do things with alacrity, with zeal. It seems to be, it's an evaluation of Chazal. Chazal evaluated the personalities and the mindset of Kohanim differently than other segments of Klal Yisrael. Seemingly that's where it's coming from. But from what the Ramban is saying here, no. It's clearly extrapolated from the Torah itself, this understanding of the persona of a Kohen versus other segments of Klal Yisrael. Because why were all mitzvahs repeated in Sefer Dvarim, which is called Mishnah Torah, and the book of Vayikra, which pertains to the Kohanim, how they officiate, what they do and how they do, and the laws of contamination, why isn't that repeated? So Ramban says it's not necessary because it doesn't have to be repeated for them. For the average Jew, it has to be repeated. But the Kohen who's Zrizim, he does things with alacrity and with that focus, it doesn't have to be repeated. He doesn't have those blind spots that every other Jew has. So this concept is not a rabbinic evaluation, but rather it's clearly extrapolated from the omission that it's not repeated in Sefer Dvarim, the laws of Sefer Vayikra, which is Torah's Kohanim, all the other laws, that tells us clearly it's not necessary to repeat it. It's not necessary to repeat it. Okay? Where do we find something similar to this? I always mention there's a Ritva in Rosh Hashanah, where the Ritva says we have the two psukim in the Torah. We know Rosh Hashanah in the Torah is referred to as Yom Trua. Yom Trua means the day of the blast. But yet, the Torah also refers to Rosh Hashanah as Zichron Trua. Zichron means the remembrance of the blast. So the Gemara asks, is it the day that you blow the shofar, or is it the day that you only commemorate and refer to the blowing of the shofar, but you don't actually blow it? So the Gemara answers that when Rosh Hashanah falls out during the week, it's Yom Trua. If it falls out on Shabbos, it's Zichron Trua. We don't blow the shofar because there's a concern, as Rabbah says, that if a person is not really sufficiently adept and learned how to blow the shofar, he may transport it through public domain, to take it to a chacham to teach him. Therefore, they suspended the obligation. And Chazal have the ability to actually to uproot a mitzvah if it's within the context of being passive. So the obvious question is, it's a rabbinic fence. Here we have two explicit psukim in the Torah. One says it's the day of the blast, the other says it's the remembrance of the blast. So what does that mean? On a Torah level, one does not blow the shofar. And yet the Gemara says, when it says Zichron Trua, it's referring to when Shabbos, Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos, we don't blow the shofar. We don't blow the shofar. It's a rabbinic fence. So Ritva is a very fundamental principle. And he says, if you don't believe in this principle, Ein lo chelu b'Torah Moshe Rabbeinu. It's considered literally like rejecting a fundamental principle, which you consider a heretic. What is that? There's certain very often you find the Gemara, it's referred to as asmachta. Asmachta means Chazal find a word which normally means it's a mnemonic. It's merely, really, the Torah is not actually, I'll give you an example. There's the famous argument between Rambam and Ramban, is the obligation of Shmon Esrei of Tefillah, is that a Torah obligation or is that a rabbinic obligation? It's a question. What is it based upon? The Gemara says, how do we know that there is an obligation for Tefillah? Because it says, U'la'avdo b'chol levavchem, in the Kriya Shema, you should serve God with all your heart. It says, b'chol levavchem. So the Gemara says, Elu ezi avoda shebelev. What's avoda in the heart? Zu tefillah. So the Rambam explains those words is a true interpretation of those words. The Torah is saying, avoda shebelev tefillah. That's a Torah interpretation of those words. Therefore, the obligation to say the Shmon Esrei once in 24 hours is a Torah obligation. Ramban disagrees. He says it's asmachta. That's not what it means. It's referring, you should serve God with all your heart. It's not specifically referring to tefillah. It's rabbinical. It's a rabbinic asmachta. It's mnemonic. So, of course, Rav Meir Simcha explains, everybody agrees, the concept is a Torah concept, that you could have an audience with God if you're a Jew when you choose to. But the question is, the Torah, is it obligatory or it's something which it's up to one to choose yes or no? So the Ritva writes that very often, sometimes the Torah is red flagging certain things. For instance, when Torah says Zichron Trua, the Torah is not saying you're not permitted to blow the shofar when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos. However, what the Torah is alluding to and red flagging, that there is an issue that somebody may transport a shofar on Shabbos who's not adept, and because he's so committed, he may not realize it's Shabbos and inadvertently transport the shofar. However, the Torah allows Chazal to determine and decide when they want to actually legislate that fence. But the Torah is alerting to us that there is this red flag issue, that it is a concern, and it's up to Chazal to promulgate that fence or not promulgate the fence. So it's not Chazal came up with an idea. By the Torah saying Zichron, it's alerting us that there is such a concern. Now it's up to you when you feel in history, at what time in period history do you want to legislate it, legislate. If they choose not to, not to. The same thing with U'la'avdu b'chol levavchem. The Torah said there is such a thing as avodah shebelev. And what is that? That's tefillah. Is the Torah saying you have an obligation? Or is the Torah saying no, there is such a thing? So rabbinically, the Ramban holds, they obligated us. They legislated, you have to pray 3 times a day. But at Torah level, you don't even have to pray once a day. That's the asmachta. I'm saying similarly here, that the Chazal made an evaluation, that Kohanim's Rizimheim, it's not their personal evaluation. That the Torah omits, Torah's Kohanim, that the mitzvahs of Vayikra are not repeated in Mishnah Torah, which all the other mitzvahs are repeated. Why aren't they repeated? The answer is because since the Kohen is naturally, he does things with focus and cognizance and alacrity, it's not necessary to repeat it. This is the concept. That's the Ramban. Avol Yisrael Yazir HaMitzvos HaNogus Ben. But for the Jews, for the ordinary Jews, you have to repeat it. And Moshe has to again repeat it. Pam Lahosif Ban Biur. Either to elucidate it, Upam Shel Yazir Osan Rak Lahazir Al Yisrael Barov HaSoros. Kamo Shivar B'Sefer Hazeh Binyonei Avodo Zoro HaSoros Merubo Zu Achazu B'Tochochos. Especially in certain failings of the past, like idolatry, It's repeated multiple times because of the seriousness of that transgression. And he has to also mention certain things to instill fear in us, that not to cross those lines because of the ramifications and the liabilities of actually transgressing, failing those areas. Then he says something very interesting, also very fundamental. In Sefer Devarim, there's certain mitzvahs that were not mentioned in the earlier Svarim. What are they? Gon Yibum, the laws of levirate marriage. V'din Motzi Shemra, a man marries a woman, and then he goes and slanders her, and he accuses her, he brings witnesses, false witness, she committed adultery. Hagrush Gerushin Be'isha, the laws of divorce, that a man could actually terminate his relationship with his wife through a divorce, a writ of divorce. Edim Zomimim, this is Jay's favorite subject, Edim Zomim, right? Conspiring witnesses. Zulosan, so now this is very important. Ukvar Nemru lo kulam b'Sinai obol moed b'shon rishonu. All these mitzvahs, although they're not recorded in the Chumash, but they were transmitted to Moshe at Sinai or Ol Moed. They're already taught. And then, Kodem HaMeraglim, before this incident of the Meraglim, which was the second year, there was only, we had a covenant, a new covenant before we went to Eretz Yisrael. There was a bris. Remember the bris of communal responsibility, arevos, that every Jew is responsible for the other. Therefore, it doesn't say Hashem spoke, command them, because we previously commanded. In all the other Chamoshim, it says, speak to Bnei Yisrael, tzav it's Bnei Yisrael, command them. First, it's a repetition. If it's a repetition, you don't have to command them. This is only review and elucidation. Okay? Oh, dabra Bnei Yisrael v'amarta le'em mitzvah plonis, avol lo nichtu ha-mitzvahs b'svorim ha-rishonim, she'idabrim yotzi Mitzrayim. Okay? But this is the principle.